Hi, welcome to today's tutorial. In a little while we're going to get to the primary meat of this tutorial, which is a subject that strikes terror in the hearts of a lot of studio photographers. It's going to be photographing a white-on-white subject. In other words, a white subject and a white background, and it's terror on the set for a lot of people. But before we do, I wanted to do a mini tutorial on incident light reading. Why so many photographers, professional and advanced amateurs, use incident light meters as opposed to reflected light meters. When you use a reflected light meter, the light hits the subject, bounces off the subject, is reflected back to the camera's sensor, and the camera reads the light that has already been adulterated, changed by the color of the subject. The meter is calibrated to give correct exposure if the subject is a middle gray. But what happens if the subject is in front of a black background or wearing a black shirt? Or what happens if the subject is in front of a white background or wearing a white shirt? The reality is that what the camera does is it overexposes black things so that they become a middle gray, and it underexposes white things so that they also become a middle gray. So if you were photographing a black gorilla in the inner parts of a cave at the zoo, and he was sitting there looking at you, and you took a reflected light reading of him, you would get a light reading that would overexpose the gorilla till his black coat was a gray. And what you'd really have to do is take a reflected light reading and then know enough to stop your lens down or cut your shutter speed by one stop so that the black gorilla actually looked black. Likewise, if you were doing a white fox frolicking in the snow and you took a reflected light reading of that, the snow would, and the fox itself would look dingy because the camera would suggest an exposure that underexposed the white subject you were photographing on the white background, and it would underexpose it so that it too was a middle gray. What you can do, and one way around this, and one technique that professional photographers and advanced amateur photographers use, is they use an item called an incident light meter. And they use an incident light meter to take an incident reading, which is a reading where you catch the light before it's reflected off the subject so that it hits this dome, and then the meter suggests a reading for the light regardless of what color the subject is, whether it's black, white, gray, yellow, purple, it doesn't matter. In fact, if you ever look on the sideline at a sporting event, you'll see photographers with incident light meters hanging around their necks. You'll also see them in almost every studio and in a lot of professional circles. It gives you consistent light readings, and it isn't affected by the color that your subject is, the color of the light your subject is reflecting back. If you ever spend some time on video sets or cinema sets, you'll start to see that the people who use light meters on those sets have incident light meters also, but instead of using the rounded dome that represents a three-dimensional subject, they use a flat receptor, where the dome is either retracted or it's a flat receptor that's a separate accessory for the meter, and it allows them to read individual lights. Now, in the ratio tutorial that we produced a while ago, we showed pictures of the light meter with the dome extended, still photographs. But importantly, if you look carefully at when those light readings were taken, the dome was retracted so that we could read each light individually. It's important to realize that if you want to compare one light to another, such as the main light to the fill light, what you really have to do is you have to retract the dome or use a flat receptor so that when you read one light, the light from another source is not affecting your light reading. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention about that ratios tutorial was that we started off with a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning the main light and the fill light were of equal power and equidistant from the subject. It was shadowless lighting, and basically there were no shadows formed at all. And then we slowly backed off the fill light until we lowered its output by 4 f-stops. When we did that, we noted that that was a 5-to-1 ratio. However, there was only a 4-stop difference between the two lights. That's because the lights started off with both of them putting out 1 unit of light, and as we kept backing the fill light further and further away from the mannequin head we were using as a subject, we eventually got a 4-stop difference because we started off at 1 and we went to 5. So the difference between 1 and 4 was 1 and 5 was 4 f-stops. The reason why I mention this is because that really wasn't the point of the tutorial. The point of the tutorial is that you should understand that as a ratio becomes steeper, 1-to-4, 1-to-5, the subject, the shadow side of the subject basically becomes black. There's no detail to be seen in that side of the picture. Equally true when the ratio is much lower, like 1-to-2 or 1-to-1 or 1-to-3, the shadows are more open and you see shadow detail, you see detail in those shadows. So the point is to get a feel for what kind of ratio you're going to get just by taking a light reading. When the idea is to get a feel for how dark the shadows are going to be and how dramatic they're going to be when you decide to go to a steep ratio, or how open the shadows are going to be when you decide to go for a very shallow or very, very small change between the main light and the fill light. Like a fox frolicking in the snow, a white fox frolicking in white snow, subjects can disappear if they are the same color as their background. The foxes use it to camouflage themselves when they're hunting. And the point is that the fox can almost disappear to predators or to prey, and they use that. The trouble is that if you're photographing a product that's white and you're faced with photographing it on a white background, you don't really want it to disappear. For this particular photograph, we arranged a white soup bowl and 3 white cups and a white mime mask, and we put them on a white background made out of a piece of translucent acrylic, and then we put a sheet of Set Shop Tough Lux behind them where we had light coming through that sheet of diffusion material. And then the last thing we did is we put a flash in my camera's hot shoe, and the flash had an orange filter on it so it would balance to the lights that we're using to make this video. This orange filtered flash ended up being a frontal light, which created basically shadowless illumination, and that shadowless light, right, made the subjects disappear. If you look at the picture, you'll see that the edges of the subject start to blend into the background, that the subjects basically disappear and have very, very little detail. One of the things that you have to realize when you're photographing white on white objects or white on white subjects on a white background, white subjects on a white background, is that the thing that makes the product stand out, the thing that helps define the shape of the product is shadows. The shadows are the really important part of the picture because otherwise the subject and the background all blur together. The picture you're looking at now has, we turned off the camera shoe-mounted flash and we just used lights that were placed more to the sides of the subject. And those lights gave the subjects a more three-dimensional feel and created shadows and made the subject stand out against the white background. So the first lesson to learn is when you're going to be shooting white subjects on a white background, you can't turn around and put a flash in your hot shoe. It's just not going to work. It doesn't even have to be a flash in your hot shoe. The idea is that you can't put a flash on the lens axis, very close to the lens, because that light will create shadowless illumination, and those shadows are something that you desperately need to make the subjects pop. We're coming to the next step in our little tutorial here, which is photographing a white product on a white background on a white surface. All right, what we've done is we've taken a white bottle of mouthwash and we've rested it on a piece of white translucent plexiglass. Under the plexiglass we have a light that's coming, light is coming up. Behind the subject we have a sheet of Set Shop Tough Lux. And we have a light behind that shining through the Set Shop Tough Lux to light the background behind the subject. The front of the product is lit by a diffusion frame to this side of the subject, which has light coming through it and is lighting the label. And over on this side, we've placed a fill card, which is kicking light back into this side of the subject. The problem is that if you expose for the light coming through the table and through the background and make it not overexpose, then the front of your bottle is going to look gray and dingy because it's not a light surface. And if you expose for the front of the bottle to make it look alive and exciting and make it look white, these two surfaces are going to be powerful enough that they're going to create a flare. A flare is when you have a light source in your photograph, such as the sun or a spotlight, that the rays from that light source bounce off the elements in your lens and create like a ball of color. It's a distraction, and it might look very good in a sunset picture, or it might look very good if you have a motorcycle riding off Easy Rider style into the sunset, but it's not good when you're photographing a product. If, on the other hand, you photograph it so that the surface of the table and the background don't flare, then all of a sudden the front of the bottle becomes sort of gray and dingy. Because if these are white, these are light sources, that would mean that the bottle itself, which is not a light source, is going to be darker than them. No matter what you do at that point, the subject, the product, doesn't look white. It looks gray. The last problem that you have to deal with is not a flare, but a glare. By carefully manipulating this bottle one way or the other, you can, at a certain place, you can get light that literally bounces off the label into the lens. And that's a glare, and that causes the label to be illegible. So you might have to like rotate it ever so slightly one way or the other to get it to be just where you want it to be. The real problem when you're photographing a white subject on a white surface in front of a white background is deciding which part of the subject or which surface is going to be the white. Usually, almost all the time, what you're looking for is you want the subject to have the white spot on it, the subject to be partially white. Because if that subject is white, your viewer will understand that even if other parts of it aren't white, they're just slightly in shadow. So the goal that we've got to come up with is we've got to come up with a way of making the bottle not look gray and dingy and have a little bit of life to it. Our highlight we have to figure out a way of getting our highlight onto the bottle. That's going to be our next step. In the last segment, the bottle looked gray and dingy. What I decided and what we spoke about, what I mentioned to you, was that if we could get some part of the primary subject, the bottle of mouthwash, to look white and to look bright and alive, then it would make the bottle the primary subject of the picture instead of the background being the important part of the picture. To accomplish that, I foregoed using a single light centered in the background and instead put one light to either side of the background. The reason for doing this was to create these two highlights on the sides of the bottle. Those two highlights sort of show that the bottle itself is white, and it makes the bottle appear more important. Finally, so that the background wouldn't be burned out, on each of the backlights, which there are two of now, I put a barn door. The two barn doors created that sort of dark rectangle that you see in the middle of the background, which is all well and good that I've made the bottle look exciting and alive and the brightest part of my picture, but at the same time I've gone away from the original concept, which was to create a white subject shoot a white subject on a white background. So what we've got to do now is figure out how to get the bottle off of a gray background and onto a white background, while at the same time holding these two highlights on the sides of the bottle. That's what we're going to do next. Finally, to get back to some light on my background, because that was the original concept we were trying to do, I moved the two side lights in on either side of the picture, on either side behind the background, so that all of a sudden they intruded on the frame. Also, the curve of the edge of those lights' patterns follows the curve on the bottle. It also allowed me to keep the highlights on both sides of the bottle. This is my finished picture, and it's a combination of light and dark areas, and it makes the bottle of mouthwash appear to be the star of the show. I hope you like it, and I hope you had a good time with this tutorial. Just as a quick recap, I started off with my subject turned at a slight angle. I put my subject on a sheet of white translucent plexiglass. I put a light under that sheet of plexiglass so that it gave us a circle of light beneath the subject. Then I put a diffusion frame over here, and I put a light behind it, and that light lit the front of my subject. I then put a fill card on this side of the subject to bounce light back into the shadow. Finally, I put a background of Set Shop Tough Lux behind my subject, and I put a single light coming through it. The camera is back here, looking at the subject. All right. So then we saw the result, and the subject looked dingy. So we got rid of this light, and we put a light on either side. We replaced that single light with two lights that gave us the rim light on the side of the subject. But that at the same time made the background gray because we flagged them off with flags so that they lit the subject but didn't light the background. We decided that the background was too gray, so we took this light and we moved it inward. And we took this light and we moved it inward. And it gave us the same light on the edges of the subject, but at the same time, their beams of light lit the background for us. And that is exactly what we did.